Hello. First tonight, the terrible story of the girls in Yeovil who were abused over years and repeatedly let down by the authorities. 6 girls as young as 13 were groomed by 2 men who were jailed in 2016. Many of them went on to have children by their abusers.
Today, a report was published into the case. It said there were 14 missed opportunities to help. It criticised social services for not investigating concerns after the girls had repeated pregnancies. It said lessons had to be learnt after one of the girls was wrongly taken to court for racial abuse, while her abuser wasn't investigated until years later. Our social affairs correspondent Fiona Lambden has spoken exclusively to the girls. Her report contains some distressing language.
I was raped and beaten for 5 years, sometimes pinned down and pierced.
This young woman who can't be identified met Mehmet Shitak when she was just 13 years old. 6 months into the relationship, she found out he was actually 15 years older than her. He was 28, was married with children. He'd be waiting most days to take her out of school, where he'd take her back to Legends, the barber piercing shop he owned in Yeovil.
What did he force you to do?
He used to feed me drugs. I had to take cocaine, marijuana, speed, most of them. I think he fed me every single one apart from heroin.
And if you didn't want to take the drugs, what would happen?
I'd get hit. Many times I'd go back to my parents with black eyes, completely beaten up. I'd have to lie to my parents and say that I got into a fight.
During the course of the 5-year relationship, she got pregnant 4 times.
What happened when you told him that you were pregnant?
I had 3 miscarriages when I was 15. They weren't natural miscarriages. They were beaten out of me.
Did they have a questionnaire?
No.
Did they see your age?
Yes.
And how old were you?
15. They should have looked into it.
He beat you and he raped you. Why didn't you just leave?
I had no choice. I was terrified of him. You know what he'll do if he doesn't get his own way? He put me in the boot of his car.
Did you report him to the police? What did they say?
I reported him more than 10 times. The first time I was 14. The police took statements and nothing was done. It was no further action all the time.
But this 13-year-old wasn't the only girl Shitak was grooming. He and his friend Ahmet Kertmez, known as Nico, preyed on many young girls. I met another of their victims this week.
So you were 14 when you met him. How quickly did the relationship progress?
First day I was introduced to him, we had sex with each other. It was in the piercing shop where he worked. He gave me a free piercing and it was expected that I give him something in return. I was way too young and he was way too old.
I mean, it could have been prevented, couldn't it? And how does that make you feel? You didn't need to go through what you had to go through.
All of them let me down. Police, social services, the hospital, everyone, they all let me down. At the hospital, I was covered in bruises, blood everywhere, hand marks. None of it made any difference. They weren't going to look into it. It makes me feel sick. My childhood disappeared. I didn't have a childhood.
Well, the abuse centred on a barber shop in Yeovil between 2010 and 2014.
As we've just heard, the girls told the police time and again, but it took several years before their complaints were properly investigated. Scott Ellis is in Yeovil for us tonight. Scott.
Yeah, the report does make grim reading for anybody living in this part of Somerset, as you've been hearing 2 grown men able to abuse teenage girls right here in the middle of Yeovil, not far from where I'm stood. One of them ran a barber shop, as you've been hearing. It was a tattoo parlour, and you could get piercings there, the sort of place that young girls would go. The abuse appearing on the radar of health professionals, social workers and the police, but not enough questions asked, the abuse going unchallenged. It is a complex area. At times, those teenage girls thought they were in loving, caring relationships. In fact, they were being physically, emotionally and sexually abused. The two Turkish men, Mehmet Şitak and Ahmet Kodyemez, who were jailed last year for sexual offences aged 34 and 29. And this, the barber shop in Yeovil, where they had sex with 6 underage girls. It now has new owners. Today's report looks into the case of 2 of those teenage girls. In the case of one known as Child Q, there were a total of 6 referrals to Somerset Social Services as early as 2010 by care professionals and her own father. There were worries she was having a relationship with a 26-year-old man and worries she'd had a miscarriage. Somerset County Council said today its reliance on using agency social workers didn't help.
And by not providing consistent social workers at the time, we didn't actually get to know the young people, understand their issues and understand what was happening in their lives outside the family home.
And that's because you're using agency workers. Has anything changed?
Well, we've recruited more social workers. We've increased the social work workforce by 20%.
Child Q had 2 miscarriages in hospital aged 15, one supported by her mother and another the following year. No questions were asked. In the case of Child C, in 2011, her school told police the 15-year-old was pregnant, but it wasn't recorded as a crime. She had a termination in hospital, but there were no safeguarding concerns. After attempting suicide, Child C was referred to a mental health hospital in Somerset in 2011 as an inpatient, but still the man would visit and take her out.
I think that's a shocker. It's an absolute shocker. And again, it's about that, I've said it before, that professional curiosity. What are we thinking that could be happening?
In 2012, both Child Q and C went on to have babies to the same man, referred to as perpetrator A.
And I met this guy. He seemed nice at first, but he started...
The girls thought they were in loving relationships. It took a letter from Child Q's mother to Avon and Somerset's Police and Crime Commissioner in 2014 before the men were arrested.
We learned, following on from that early stage in 2012, the resources that this kind of investigation needs. It's complex and it's difficult. It didn't get that level of resourcing in these stages. The report quickly identifies that.
The authorities say lessons have been learnt and that child safety is now everyone's top priority. Scott Ellis, BBC Points West, Yeovil.
Sally Halls is the independent chair of the Somerset Safeguarding Children's Board. I asked her whether the agencies had been naive, believing it just couldn't happen in Somerset.
Had each professional from a range of agencies been rather more curious about what they were being told and what they were seeing, there might have been an opportunity to prevent the exploitation that these girls were experiencing at an earlier stage.
But they simply didn't, did they? The police didn't investigate, and when they did, resources were inadequate.
It's correct that it wasn't followed up for far too long. It took till 2014 before there was a more robust approach. But it's also to do with the level of understanding amongst agencies at the time, and indeed nationally.
But the girls pleaded for help, didn't they? I mean, in one case, whilst one of these children was in hospital having a second miscarriage, the rapist, who was 10 years older than her, was allowed visiting rights.
Indeed, and incidents like that are highlighted in the report simply can't be explained away, nor would I seek to. The report details opportunity after opportunity where professionals could have intervened, and I would like to think these days would intervene, but at that time they did not.
That's why I asked you if they were simply gullible. I mean, instead of listening to the concerns from the parents became the focus of social services for trying to discipline the girls.
It's correct that at the time there was much more understanding and awareness about abuse and difficulties within families. There was less awareness at the time of the kind of risks that are present outside families. So this did mean that for social workers who got engaged with some of the families on some of the occasions, they didn't look further. But they also had to contend with being told contradictory things over a period as well. So for the professionals involved, it clearly was quite difficult to understand exactly what the true situation was.
Look, I completely understand that these things are not simple at all, but I just wonder, are there any consequences for anybody for any of these failings?
These events happened many years ago. I know that the social workers involved at that time are no longer in the employment of Somerset County Council. My concern is to focus on now, 2017 onwards, and ensuring that the professionals across all agencies are alert and aware of this particular kind of sexual exploitation, about which there was very little understanding at the time.
Sally Hawes, grateful to you for joining us. Thank you very much.
It's a difficult subject, isn't it? But it's so important to talk about it. You're watching BBC Points West with David and Alex.
You are, and still